Hello, welcome to the Beasley Equine Podcast. I'm your host and equine veterinarian, Dr. Travis Beasley. Today, we're going to dive into a topic that's critical for every horse owner to understand, and that's rabies. And this isn't just another disease, it's a real zoonotic threat, meaning it can affect you, your horse, your pets, and even your friends and neighbors. It's a rare but deadly disease, and knowledge is going to be your best defense about it. Stay tuned as we dive into rabies.
Veterinary surgeon or start to come quick. Draw the syringe and give it a flick. Bring your little black bag with the medicines in. Bring the trank and the crank and the penicillin.
So what is rabies? Rabies is a fatal zoonotic disease caused by a virus in the group of the lyssaviruses, and it affects mammals worldwide. Rabies is the most significant virus in this class of viruses, and it affects the central nervous system of the mammals. And the central nervous system, by that we mean the brain and the spinal cord. And it leads to very quick and strange behavioral changes in horses and people, and eventually leads to paralysis, where horses can't move, can't breathe, can't drink, can't swallow, can't eat. And one thing that you really got to understand is once we get clinical signs of rabies, it is 100% fatal in animals and humans. Once you get signs of rabies, the clinical signs, 100% your animal or you are going to die. And we mentioned it's zoonotic, and that means it can spread from animals to humans. And that's what makes it a really big public health concern. So why that matters for horse owners is your horses, dogs, cats, wildlife, even your family can contract and transmit rabies, putting your barn and your household at risk. So how is rabies spread? Rabies is a little bitty virus that's enveloped and kind of bullet-shaped, and it's got single-stranded RNA. Not really that important, but those 5 proteins that are encoded in there are very nootropic, meaning they really target nervous tissue, the brain and spinal cord and the peripheral nerves. So they will travel from a site of a bite from an infected animal to the brain through the peripheral nerves. So the peripheral nerves are the nerves outside of our brain and spinal cords. Those are the ones that are sending signals to and from the brain. For instance, if you touch something hot, that nerve gets fired, tells your brain you're touching something hot, and then your brain sends info back down that says, take your hand off whatever's hot. So it's primarily spread through bites from infected animals because the virus is found in the saliva. Globally, the main reservoirs of rabies are dogs, but bats, raccoons, foxes, skunks, cats, everything can kind of transmit it. The less common transmission is still via saliva, but not from a bite, from an already a wound on a hand for something. So that's less common, but what do we do as veterinarians? One of the first things we do when we check a horse or another animal is you'll see us lift their lip up and touch their mucous membranes. We can see how hydrated they are that way. But say I've got a little cut on my hand and I stick my hand in your horse's mouth, that is potentially putting me at risk. Or if you are putting a halter on and you get slobber on you, etc. And, a lot of the emergencies come in, we don't really know what's going on. So, and we'll get in a hurry. Sometimes we don't put gloves on. So say you're stressed out, check out your vet, checks the mucous membranes, maybe forgets to wash his hands, gets stressed out, pops his in. That is a possible way to get it through the mucous membrane in the mouth too. And then even rarer is aerosol transmission from like a bat-heavy environment. If you walk in a cave where a bunch of rabid bats, they can't aerosolize the virus, and you can breathe it in. Once you are exposed to the virus, the incubation period, meaning how long it takes to really get those clinical signs, varies from 3 weeks to even 80 days in dogs. And I read even up to a year in some really rare cases. So it depends on the bite location and how much virus you get in that bite. I said it travels up peripheral nerves. So the closer you are to the brain and spinal cord, the quicker you're going to get these signs. So say a bite on the face versus a bite on the toe, the face is going to get those signs sooner just because of location. So, how is rabies spread? So, it's found worldwide except in Antarctica. And some countries are rabies free due to very strict controls and guidelines. Hawaii's rabies free because of their strict quarantine laws. Anytime we ship a horse to Hawaii, they quarantine in California for at least 10 days or however they're getting there. And in North America, there's distinct virus variants, meaning little differences in the viruses in raccoons, foxes, skunks, and bats. And horses can contract rabies most significantly through bites from infected wildlife. Raccoons, bats, skunks, and cats. Cats are the most commonly reported rabid domestic animal in the US. And what does everybody have in their barn? Barn cats. So, wildlife exposures to your animal do put them at risk, but that you don't need to be super terrified of this. But um, a friend of mine was down at the coast fishing, and there was a group of people in the middle of the day. They were getting ready to fish, and there was a raccoon messing with these people, which we all know raccoons are nocturnal animals. So my vet friend was rabies top of his head. He starts yelling at these people, "Hey, don't mess with that. That thing's rabid." He kept telling them it's rabid, meaning it had rabies. And they just yelled back, "Man, this isn't a rabbit, it's a raccoon." So we call animals that have rabies rabid, not rabbits, rabid with a D. So what happens if you or your horse or other animals get bit? What are the clinical signs or what do we see from this disease? We'll see acute behavioral changes, meaning very quick changes in behavior. They may be more irritable, they'll get aggressive, they might want to be by themselves, just kind of real weird things. And then it progresses to paralysis. So they might get a little unsteady, they'll quit being able to swallow, their jaw might droop, especially in dogs. And there's three phases of this. There's a prodromal, which you get kind of vague signs 1 to 3 days. You just notice something's off about your animal, just ain't doing right. And then there's the acute excitative stage, which is what we call the furious form. That's those dogs that are foaming at the mouth and really mean and rabid by definition. And then the end stage are what we call the paralytic, where everything kind of paralyzes. So the furious form is also called mad dog syndrome because there's a lot of aggression. They'll bite objects, they'll attack moving objects, and horses may bite, strike, kick, show extreme agitation that can really resemble colic. I've also seen horses self-mutilate with this, not personally, but in videos. They'll attack their legs until they rip all the meat off of it down to the bone. And back to my example of the rabid raccoon on the coast, rabid wildlife, they kind of lose their fear of humans. So they might attack pets and they might have those nocturnal or nighttime behaviors during the day. So anytime I see a skunk or any of those nocturnal animals acting weird during the daytime, I really just assume they have rabies, and at least around my place, we dispose of those quickly and properly. The paralytic form, it paralyzes the throat and masseter muscles. So that's why a lot of these animals have so much saliva, and even people too. We can't swallow that normal saliva and swallowing reflex we don't even think about during the day. That's why a lot of these animals drool much. But if you think about it from a rabies point of view, what a great way to spread the disease because they can't swallow it. And if you're brave enough to Google humans with rabies, you'll actually see them. They get scared of water because they know they can't swallow it. So there's one terrible video of a gentleman that had rabies, and he would hold the glass up and he'd try to take a drink. And even if he got close to his mouth, he'd just start trembling because he knows he can't swallow that. So some horses will also do some other weird things like abnormal vocalizations. They may start attacking themselves. And that's one thing about the clinical signs in horses and other animals. Rabies in horses can look like anything. You may think the horse is colicking because they'll roll and kind of be agitated and appear painful. And again, what's one of the first things we do to a colic? We look at their mucous membranes. We look for a toxicline. We see how good they're perfusing. We see if they're tacky. And that's a potential route for rabies. They can even show up like a foot abscess. They may act like they're really lame on one leg. It can really mimic anything. So when we have an emergency that we don't really know what's going on, in an unvaccinated horse, rabies is always on top of the list, meaning we have to take a lot of care to protect ourselves and the horse and the owner and other animals in the area. Cattle, they kind of do the same thing. One thing people notice in cattle is they'll stop lactating, especially the dairy cows. They'll kind of get mean towards humans, and they'll do a lot of bellowing and stuff. And with bats, they lose that fear of people and they'll start attacking them. So clinical signs are suggestive but not definitive. So if a horse is neurological and unvaccinated, we always assume rabies is on the list. Some challenges to diagnosing and testing these things to know if it's rabies is there's no antemortem test, meaning there's no test we can perform while your horse is alive to say they have rabies or not. We can't draw blood. We can't do a swab. We have to diagnose rabies post-mortem or after the horse dies. And like I said, the clinical signs can mimic about anything. So lab confirmation is very critical. That way we know how worried we need to be about people or other animals that were exposed. And the way they do this is they actually look at the brain tissue from an animal that's deceased. So to test it in a horse that we suspect rabies, we have to euthanize the animal. How do we humanely euthanize animals on a routine basis? We give them an IV dose of euthanasia. The horse literally falls asleep. Unfortunately, with rabies, if the horse is aggressive or unsafe to be around, myself or any other veterinarian I know is not going to get that close and potentially expose themselves to rabies or be hurt by a horse that's showing these signs. So it's usually something from a distance, meaning a gunshot. But how do we test for rabies afterwards? We have to have the brain. So the humane headshot to the brain to instantly kill a horse is kind of out of the option for this because we have to test those horses. So a lot of times if your horse is in that stage, you don't really need a vet. You need a pretty good hunter that's a pretty good shot because we're going to have to shoot that horse in the heart and preserve that brain tissue for testing. And it's also a reportable disease, so anytime we suspect it, us as veterinarians got to follow our local and state guidelines for reporting it to the authorities. And I want to stress that it's so important that if your horse has any of these signs and is dispatched, do not delay testing because of the huge impacts to human safety and animal safety. We got to know who's been exposed to these horses, other animals, and start the prevention so it doesn't spread to people. But how do we prevent this in horses? It's super easy. It's vaccination. Rabies is considered a core disease, meaning every horse should be vaccinated for it. It's also core for dogs and cats and even ferrets, because evidently people have pet ferrets. And there are USDA licensed vaccines for domestic animals. There's none for wildlife, except there's some oral vaccines and control programs, but maybe they'll get there eventually. But they have eliminated rabies in some fox and coyote populations with the oral vaccines. So make sure your horse is vaccinated for rabies, and then register your dogs that are vaccinated. Really make sure if you're in an area, like follow the leash laws, make sure everybody's enforcing it, because normally the people that are going to follow the leash laws also have their dogs vaccinated for rabies. And try to avoid contact with wildlife if you can, just like those guys messing with that raccoon. You see something like that, just stay away. It's good for the wildlife and ourselves. And then the other thing we can do to prevent it is, if you're listening to this, educate your friends and family on it. Educate the barn staff, because one reason is if you think you're exposed to rabies. A friend of mine just got bit by a loose dog in town. He has to go through a pretty terrible series of shots to prophylactically treat for rabies, even though he may or may not be exposed. And unvaccinated pets that are exposed to rabies usually end up getting euthanized or they can go to 4 to 6 months of strict isolation and immediate vaccination. But most of the time, that's not even possible in most parts of the country. If your vaccinated pet is exposed, we always revaccinate immediately, booster those antibodies, and then kind of really watch them close for 6 weeks or so. The other way we can prevent it is disinfecting. Rabies virus is pretty easily killed by heat, UV light, and disinfectants like alcohol. So it's always a good protocol to disinfect on a regular basis, but especially after anything strange has happened with your horse, whether you're sick for whatever reason. So I want to encourage everybody listening to this, if you're unaware what your horses have for vaccines, call your vet. Make sure they're getting that rabies in their yearly shot, and your other animals too. And you can protect yourself and your horse and your other pets and your household just by a simple rabies shot. Rabies has the highest fatality rate of any infectious disease in humans. And then they get that bite, and that can get it. And like I said, if you get exposed to rabies, like my friend that may or may not have been, it's wound care and it's rabies immune globulin and a rabies vaccine series at the day they get bit, I think 3 days later, 7 and 14 days. And evidently these are not pleasant. The shots hurt, it's painful, and you're kind of down and out for a few weeks with this. But that post-exposure prophylaxis, the PEP we call it, is nearly 100% effective if administered promptly. So if you think you're even at risk at all, call your doctor right away, because once you get clinical signs, 100% chance you're going to die. You do the prophylactic, almost 100% chance you won't even get clinical signs. So never handle wildlife barehanded. If you have to take something out, put gloves on, and just assume bats or any wild carnivores are rabid unless they're tested. And if you have an exposed pet, confine them for 10 days. Or, this sounds bad, but most of the strays that don't have an owner attached to them are euthanized immediately and tested. And pre-exposure vaccinations recommended for high-risk groups. Before vet school, I had to go through a vaccination series. So if you're working with animals, especially those that can bite, it's a great idea to go ahead and get the prophylactic vaccine, get that series done, then sleep a little better at night. And one interesting thing about horses and rabies is everybody thinks about dogs, but horses are 4 times more likely to contract rabies than your dog, 4 times more likely. And when a positive case in horses occur, the amount of time and money that's invested after these things is just incredible, because we have to track anybody that's been exposed. They have to get all the treatments, which aren't cheap. We have to quarantine, and it's a complete nightmare if we think there's a positive horse. So we've kind of covered that pretty quick today, but rabies, very deadly virus, and it can spread through your horse, your pets, and even your family. And it's super rare, but it's very deadly. So be vigilant, and prevention is the key to keep our horses safe. Vaccination is the key to keep your horses safe. So stay cautious around wildlife, and don't hesitate to call your vet if anything seems off with your horse. And thank you guys for tuning into our podcast. We're grateful to have you in our community of passionate horse people. And if you like this episode or the other ones, be sure to share it, tell your buddies, and subscribe. And until next time, take care of your horses and yourself.
Veterinary surgeon or start to come quick. Draw the syringe and give it a flick. Bring your little black bag with the medicines in. Bring the trank and the crank and the pen.